Ladies and gentlemen, when two nations stand on the world's biggest stage and challenge each other, it is never just about politics. It is about identity, justice, survival, and the future of global order. Today we are talking about Pakistan and Israel at the United Nations, a clash that has captured headlines and conversations everywhere. But let me tell you something. What happens inside that hall is not just about two countries trading words. It is about how the world defines fairness, how nations protect their principles, and how voices, even from far away, can shake the balance of power. Think about it. Pakistan speaks not only for itself, but for millions who feel silenced, while Israel defends its very right to exist in a world where it has always felt surrounded. This is not a debate of equals. It is a battle of narratives. And in that battle, every word, every argument, every gesture matters. When you listen to this speech, don't just hear what Pakistan or Israel is saying. Ask yourself, what does this mean for the future of peace? What does it mean for Europe, for Asia, for every corner of the globe where justice and power collide? Stay with me to the very end, because the story you're about to hear is not just about conflict, but about lessons. Lessons in courage, in diplomacy, and in the timeless struggle between principle and pragmatism. If you truly want to understand why this clash has the world talking, you must listen carefully, because sometimes the most powerful truths are hidden between the lines. This is not just a speech, it is a mirror for our world today. The historical context between Pakistan and Israel is rooted in a clash of principles, identity, and geopolitics that has endured for decades. Pakistan, since its creation in 1947, aligned itself with the broader Muslim world and positioned itself as a defender of the Palestinian cause. Its refusal to recognize Israel as a legitimate state stems not only from solidarity with Palestine, but also from a deep-seated belief that the creation of Israel came at the expense of the indigenous population's rights. This stance has become part of Pakistan's foreign policy identity, shaping its voice in international forums, particularly at the United Nations. For Pakistan, the question of Israel is not only political but moral, tied to issues of justice, displacement, and the sanctity of international law. Israel, on the other hand, was established in 1948 and has since faced opposition from multiple Muslim-majority countries, with Pakistan among the most vocal. For Israel, Pakistan's position represents a significant ideological barrier, as Pakistan is the second largest Muslim country by population and possesses nuclear capabilities, giving its rejection of Israel a symbolic weight. Over the years, Israel has sought normalization with other Muslim states, especially in recent times through agreements like the Abraham Accords. But Pakistan has consistently resisted linking recognition to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. This contrast of position sets the stage for tension whenever the two nations cross paths diplomatically. The historical layer is further deepened by wars in the Middle East from 1948 to 1973 and the subsequent shifts in alliances. Pakistan often aligned itself with Arab states during these conflicts, offering political and in some cases even military support. This alignment reinforced the perception of Pakistan as a staunch supporter of the Palestinian struggle, while Israel viewed it as an adversary, albeit one at a distance. The Cold War also amplified these divisions as Pakistan's alliances with the US and the Muslim world intersected with Israel's own strategic ties with the West. At the UN, this history is manifest in strong words and symbolic gestures. Pakistan has consistently spoken against Israeli actions in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, framing them as violations of international law and human rights. Israel, meanwhile, counters with its historical narrative of survival, security, and legitimacy, portraying Pakistan's rejection as outdated and ideologically driven. These dueling narratives, built on decades of history, create a clash that resonates far beyond the walls of the UN, reminding the world that this conflict is as much about memory and principle as it is about current events. The United Nations has always been more than just a diplomatic platform. It is a stage where nations amplify their voices, shape narratives, and attempt to sway global opinion. When Pakistan and Israel confront each other in this arena, the significance goes beyond a bilateral disagreement. It becomes a symbolic battle of principles played out in front of the entire international community. For Pakistan, the UN is the most legitimate forum to challenge Israel's policies and actions, as it gives Islam the opportunity to frame its arguments within the language of international law, justice, and human rights. By highlighting issues like occupation, civilian casualties, and violations of UN resolutions, Pakistan positions itself as a representative of not only its own people, but also the broader Muslim world, reinforcing its long-standing image as a defender of Palestine. Israel conversely views the UN with suspicion, often perceiving it as a place where it is unfairly targeted by a majority of countries sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Yet, Israel also understands the necessity of defending its narrative on this stage, particularly for the benefit of Western allies and undecided nations. It uses the UN to present its perspective as a nation under constant threat, emphasizing the right to self-defense and the legitimacy of its statehood. For Israel, each appearance is not only about rebutting accusations, but also about reinforcing its alliances, especially with the United States and certain European powers, which serve as a counterbalance to widespread criticism. The clash between Pakistan and Israel at the UN gains weight because of the institution's global audience. Every statement, rebuttal, and resolution is broadcast worldwide, influencing not only governments, but also civil society, media, and public opinion. For smaller nations, the UN becomes a rare stage where their voice carries the same symbolic value as larger powers. And Pakistan has often utilized this platform to maximum effect. By articulating its position at the UN, it ensures that its perspective is heard not just regionally, but across continents, particularly in Europe, where debates about international law and human rights resonate deeply. This global stage also magnifies the political consequences of their words. A speech made in the UN General Assembly or during a Security Council debate is not just rhetoric. It becomes part of the historical record, shaping future diplomacy. The UN thus acts as a theater where both Pakistan and Israel perform for the world, aware that each word could shift alliances, harden positions, or inspire movements. This transforms their clash from a regional disagreement into a matter of international diplomacy with lasting implications. Pakistan's argument for justice at the United Nations has always been anchored in moral conviction, international law, and the principle of standing with the oppressed. For decades, Islamabad has positioned itself as the defender of Palestinian rights, using every global platform to remind the world of the plight of millions living under occupation. In doing so, Pakistan frames its stance not as a matter of bilateral rivalry with Israel, but as part of a broader struggle for justice and humanity. When Pakistani diplomats and leaders speak at the UN, they often highlight the human toll of conflict, displacement of families, destruction of homes, and the loss of innocent lives. turning abstract resolutions into urgent calls for accountability. Central to Pakistan's argument is the emphasis on international law and UN resolutions themselves. Islamabad repeatedly underscores that numerous resolutions calling for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories and recognition of Palestinian rights remain unimplemented. By pointing to the gap between promises and reality, Pakistan challenges the credibility of the international system, arguing that selective application of law undermines the very values on which the UN was founded. This legalistic approach strengthens Pakistan's case, allowing it to argue not merely on emotional grounds, but within the framework that the global community has already agreed upon. Another layer to Pakistan's argument is the principle of human rights. At a time when global audiences, particularly in Europe, are increasingly sensitive to issues of justice and humanitarian crises, Pakistan appeals to universal values. It draws attention to civilian casualties in Gaza, restrictions in the West Bank, and the humanitarian blockade, framing them as moral failings that demand collective action. Pakistan often presents itself as the voice of the voiceless, a state willing to speak truth to power, even when global politics makes others hesitate. Beyond legal and moral reasoning, Pakistan also situates its argument within the narrative of historical injustice. It consistently portrays the Palestinian question as unfinished business of decolonization, linking it to struggles for self-determination that resonate across Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe. This framing enables Pakistan to connect with a broad spectrum of nations that have themselves experienced occupation and colonial rule, thereby reinforcing its position. Ultimately, Pakistan's argument for justice is crafted not just to condemn Israel, but to appeal to the conscience of the world. It is an attempt to remind nations that beyond alliances and geopolitical interests, the UN was created to protect the vulnerable and ensure fairness. By grounding its case in law, morality, and shared human experience, Pakistan seeks to transform its position from a regional stance into a universal call for justice. Israel's defense and counter-narrative at the United Nations is built on a foundation of survival, security, and legitimacy. From its perspective, every accusation leveled against it must be understood in the context of a nation that has faced hostility since the moment of its creation in 1948. At the UN, Israeli representatives consistently remind the global community that their state emerged after centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust, and that the establishment of Israel was not only a political event, but a moral necessity. This historical backdrop serves as a shield, positioning Israel's actions as responses to existential threats rather than mere exercises of power. Security is the cornerstone of Israel's defense. When criticized for military operations in Gaza or the West Bank, Israel frames these actions as counterterrorism measures rather than aggression. It highlights rocket attacks, militant groups operating from Palestinian territories, and the constant fear faced by its citizens. By doing so, Israel attempts to reframe the debate. Instead of being perceived as an occupier, it wants to be seen as a nation defending its people against relentless threats. The argument often centers around the idea that no country in the world would tolerate such dangers without responding, and Israel should not be judged by a different standard. And another critical aspect of Israel's counter-narrative is the question of legitimacy. Israel often argues that its right to exist as a sovereign state is non-negotiable and recognized by international law, regardless of who disputes it. When countries like Pakistan reject recognition, Israel portrays such stances as ideological refusals to accept reality rather than genuine efforts for peace. By underlining the peace treaties it has signed with countries like Egypt, Jordan, and more recently through normalization agreements with some able states, Israel emphasizes its willingness to coexist while framing its critics as unwilling to compromise. Israel also uses the UN stage to highlight what it views as double standards. It frequently accuses the institution of singling it out for criticism while ignoring human rights abuses elsewhere in the world. This narrative resonates strongly with its allies, particularly the United States and some European nations, who often echo these concerns about imbalance. By painting itself as unfairly targeted, Israel seeks to erode the credibility of resolutions or speeches directed against it, shifting the focus from its actions to the alleged bias of the international community. Through a mixture of historical justification, security concerns, and accusations of hypocrisy, Israel constructs a counter-narrative designed to defend its image and strengthen its alliances. It transforms accusations into opportunities to reinforce its identity as a small nation in a hostile environment, determined to survive and assert its place in the international order. The global audience and power dynamics surrounding the clash between Pakistan and Israel at the United Nations are as important as the arguments themselves. Every word spoken at the UN is not just addressed to the opposing country, but to an international community that interprets, judges, and reacts according to its own interest. For Pakistan, the audience includes Muslim-majority nations, developing countries, and regions like Africa and Asia that have historically sympathized with the Palestinian cause. By speaking forcefully on issues of occupation and human rights, Pakistan seeks to reaffirm its leadership role within this bloc, reinforcing solidarity and gaining diplomatic capital. Its message is crafted to resonate with nations that value principles of justice and self-determination, while also appealing to the moral conscience of audiences in Europe and beyond. Israel, however, speaks to a different but equally critical audience. Its primary focus is on maintaining the support of Western powers, particularly the United States and influential European states, which provide not only political cover, but also military and economic partnerships. When Israel responds to criticism, it is less about persuading adversaries and more about strengthening its alliances, ensuring that veto powers in the Security Council or sympathetic votes in the General Assembly remain intact. Israel's message is tailored to reinforce the idea that it shares common values with Western democracies, especially in the fight against terrorism, framing its struggle as part of a broader global battle rather than a localized conflict. Europe plays a particularly complex role in this dynamic. On one hand, European governments are under pressure from their populations, who are increasingly vocal about Palestinian rights and humanitarian concerns. On the other, strategic ties with Israel in areas like technology, trade, and security create a balancing act. Thus, speeches from both Pakistan and Israel are carefully scrutinized in Europe, where public sentiment and government policy often diverge. This makes the European audience a battleground of influence, with both sides trying to tilt opinions in their favor. The power dynamics extend beyond rhetoric, as global players often view the Pakistan-Israel clash through the lens of their own interests. The United States tends to shield Israel diplomatically, while China and Russia sometimes position themselves closer to Pakistan's narrative, not purely out of sympathy, but as a way to counter Western dominance. Smaller states, meanwhile, observe carefully, knowing that alignment in such debates signals broader political loyalties. In this way, the clash at the UN is not confined to two nations, but becomes a reflection of shifting global alliances ideological divides, and the struggle for influence in international politics. The future implications of the clash between Pakistan and Israel at the United Nations reach far beyond the walls of the General Assembly or Security Council. Each confrontation contributes to shaping the evolving global narrative about the Middle East, international law, and the role of emerging powers like Pakistan. For Pakistan, taking a strong and vocal stance on Palestine allows it to solidify its identity as a defender of Muslim causes while also expanding its influence among countries that value justice and self-determination. This positioning could give Pakistan greater weight in international coalitions, especially as debates over global governance and fairness intensify. At the same time, it risks deepening divides with Western powers, who continue to view Israel as a crucial strategic partner, meaning Islamabad will have to balance principle with pragmatism. For Israel, the implications are equally significant. Every clash at the UN reminds Tel Aviv that its legitimacy is still questioned by influential states. And Pakistan's voice carries particular weight because of its size, military strength, and symbolic status in the Muslim world. Israel may respond by intensifying its efforts to normalize relations with other Muslim-majority countries in order to isolate Pakistan diplomatically. The more Israel succeeds in building such alliances, the more Pakistan risks being portrayed as rigid or out of step with shifting regional dynamics. On the other hand, if global public opinion continues to lean towards sympathy for Palestinians, Israel may find its diplomatic defenses tested, especially in Europe, where civil society activism is strong. The larger international system will also feel the effects. The UN itself could face further challenges to its credibility if resolutions continue to pile out without meaningful enforcement, reinforcing perceptions of selective justice. This could encourage nations like Pakistan to demand reforms in global governance, pushing for a system where smaller and mid-level powers have greater influence. Such debates could shift the balance of power, especially if China, Russia, and other countries lend support to Pakistan's framing of the issue as one of justice denied. Originally, these confrontations could impact future peace prospects in the Middle East. Pakistan's firm stance might embolden Palestinian leaders and movements, while Israel's counter-narrative could strengthen its resolve to resist concessions without ironclad guarantees of security. Over time, the clash between the two nations may serve as a barometer of broader global divides between East and West, between principle and pragmatism, and between the vision of a rules-based order and the reality of power politics. Each debate at the UN thus plants seeds that could influence diplomacy, alliances, and perceptions for years to come. In conclusion, the clash between Pakistan and Israel at the United Nations is far more than a diplomatic exchange. It is a contest of narratives, principles, and global influence. Pakistan frames its position as a moral duty to uphold justice, human rights, and international law, while Israel defends its stance through the lenses of survival, legitimacy, and security. On the UN stage, both countries are not only addressing each other, but speaking to the world, each hoping to sway allies, strengthen blocs, and shape the historical record. What emerges is a reflection of how deeply interconnected justice, power, and perception are in our world today. This debate does not end when the speeches conclude. It carries forward into policy decisions, alliances, and the future of global diplomacy. The responsibility then lies with the international community and with each of us to listen, to question, and to act with fairness in the face of complex challenges. I wish you the very best as you carry forward this message. May it spark reflection, dialogue, and a renewed commitment to justice and peace. Thank you for listening, and good luck in everything you strive to achieve.